Okay, what I'm going to try to do here is list some of the different strategies that we use to make arguments and try to give some examples to help us understand them. All right, so the one that I want to start with is called an anecdote. So this is when we try to convince people, right? These are all strategies to convince people. So an anecdote is like a personal story. So say I was trying to convince you, that Rutgers is a terrible college. One way you do that, would be like, well, I went there and it was a terrible experience. Therefore, it's a terrible college. That would be telling a personal story to try to convince you. I think we've all heard these before, from friends. Well, I tried to do this and this is what happened to me. So I think we know that while they can show us something, right? It shows us someone's direct experience. Someone's experience isn't always representative of the facts of the matter, right? I could say I went to Rutgers and I had a terrible experience, but you might find 10 other people who said it was a great experience. So I think we'll see with all these different strategies for arguing that they all have their positives and negatives. There's strong points and weak points to all of them. So anecdotes, a personal story gives you an experience, but it's only one person's experience. Another one that I would want to list here is word choice. So what I mean here is that when we're trying to convince someone of something, we will choose different words to make a thing sound either good or bad, right? I think of maybe politics here as an example. When you think of certain words that politicians are going to use, like kind of buzzwords, either to make themselves sound good or their opponents sound bad, if a politician calls their opponent unpatriotic or they hate America. It's obvious that they're choosing words in a way to try to convince you that this person is bad or that you should vote for the person who's saying that. And I think we all do this. If you think of maybe arguing with like your parents or something about going out somewhere and say, "Oh, I'm just gonna go out for a little bit. I'll just be out for a minute." Uh, Even if you might be out for hours or something like that, we're gonna choose our words to make it seem like we're not gonna be gone very long, to try to make your parent more likely to be convinced by your argument that you should be allowed to go out or whatever. And really, I think both of these kind of fall under emotion. These are both kind of like emotional ways to make an argument. The words that you choose to talk about something don't actually make it more or less convincing, but it can affect the way that the person that you're talking to feels about the thing. Like I said, if you call your political opponent unpatriotic, people are going to feel bad about them, even though you might not be providing any evidence or there might not be any actual reason to say that. You're basically using the words to make the audience feel a certain way. And with anecdote, like we said, since it's only one person's experience, it has a kind of emotional appeal, and it's also more relatable. It's more we can connect with it easier, so it kind of plays on our emotions. To hear someone's personal story about what they went through. So these are both, I would say, appeals to emotion, and that might seem bad, right? Like usually, if someone calls your argument emotional, they're trying to say that it's not very good. But I think all arguments do need to use some amount of emotion. Because if you think about it, and we'll get into some other things to convince people, like one thing that we use to convince people is like statistics, and that's good, right? Statistics are hard evidence, studies, data, whatever. But if you just list a bunch of statistics for someone, they still might not be convinced. Even if you're actually right, even if the data proves that you're right, if you don't have any emotion involved, the person still might not be very convinced. Like they might just not care or not be interested or stop listening or things like that. So there is a way that emotion is good for an argument. You want your audience to be invested in the argument and care about the argument, and using emotion is one way to achieve that. So statistics, I think we know what that means. Numbers, data. Some other different ways that we convince people. Giving examples is always one. If you want to say, college should be cheaper or something like that, and then you can give an example like the average college costs this much, or if you can give examples of people who have been bankrupted because of the cost of college or something like that. Those would be examples. So two different kinds of examples that I would say. I would kind of break these up into hypothetical examples and historical examples. So maybe a better example of this than the one that I just gave is like if you're talking about college or something like that, you could say, well, other countries in history have had free college and like they seem to do okay. So that would be more of a historical example, right? And we all know a hypothetical example, not actually something from history, but something that could be true. So using examples, another way to try to convince people. One more I would add in here has to do with fairness. So kind of what I mean here is that a lot of the arguments that we have, I usually, will ask students for arguments they've had in their personal lives, and I find that a lot of those come down to fairness. Like I can remember stories of students, where like their sibling was allowed to use their parents' car, so they felt that they should also be allowed to use their parents' car, or if the parents bought your sibling something, people feel like, well, I should, also get something of equal value. And this really all comes back to fairness. It's kind of a like assumption that we have that things should be fair, and I think that's right. I think that makes sense. But based on that belief that we have that things should be fair, we then make a lot of our other arguments. Well, this isn't fair, so it should be like this, and that's a way that we try to convince people. So all three of these fairness statistics examples, I would kind of put all of those under the heading of logic. These are all ways of convincing people that are based either on hard data like these ones, or on like an appeal to morality. And morality is ultimately something that we understand through logic, through what makes sense, right? And you looked at that logic assignment that I had for you the other day, that kind of broke down some of the basics of it, of what an argument is and what the different parts of an argument are. So all of these three I would put under the heading of logic. Okay, two more strategies that I have for you here. The first one is authority. Trying to convince people based on authority. So I think this is another one that people usually think is pretty unconvincing. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. Like I said, with most of these, there's a good way to use it, and there's a bad way to use it. With authority, maybe the easiest example of this being done poorly is like, nothing against religion, but people who believe something to be true just because it says that in the Bible. I'm sure we've all experienced this. People who they'll make an argument, and then if you ask them why, or if they're trying to convince you, they'll just say like, oh, that's what God said, or that's what's in the Bible. This is an argument to authority because it's appealing to the authority of God or the Bible or whatever. But I think we can see why that's not going to convince a lot of people, because then if someone says, okay, well, I don't really care about the Bible, or I don't believe in the Bible, or something like that, then they're not going to be convinced. A better way to use an argument by authority, I think about an example a student gave me a few years ago of like their father who had diabetes, but he wouldn't listen to the doctor that he shouldn't drink soda. So the student's argument to his father was, well, the authority, the doctor in this case, says drinking soda is bad for diabetes. So maybe you should listen. And I think that's obviously a much better example. So arguing by authority, it all comes down to what the authority is, and if it's an authority that people should respect. And as long as it's a solid authority that everyone kind of agrees, okay, yeah, they should know about this, then it can actually be a pretty convincing way to make an argument. Similar to authority, and the last one I have here is credibility. So this is kind of the same thing as authority, but it's about yourself. It's about why you are credible, why your opinion on the matter should be interesting, or why your opinion on the matter should be important, or people should be convinced by it. So if I was giving you, again with the example of a doctor, if I was giving you a speech about how to take care of your health, you might want to know what my qualifications are. And then with me personally, you'd say I have no qualifications and I'm pretty unhealthy myself. So I'm probably not a very credible source on health advice. But if someone had some sort of a degree, or they're a nutritionist or a doctor or whatever, then they have more credibility, and it actually makes their argument more convincing, because that's why you should listen to them. So these two I would also kind of put together, credibility and authority. And I guess I would just call the category something like authority. And that's kind of the general category that I would put both of these under. So what we see here, And there's more that we could add to this list. I think these are kind of the biggest ones, or all the other ones probably fit like in between different grades of all of these here. But one thing that is true is that pretty much every strategy that we have to make an argument either plays on the audience's emotion and tries to get them invested in our argument, or it uses a logical claim based on examples or evidence or history or data, or it's a claim based on authority, either someone else's authority or your own authority, of being someone who would know a lot about the topic and should therefore be listened to. So you might have heard these referred to as before as logos, pathos, and ethos. I don't know why they insist on using the Greek words, in 2020. I don't really know what the benefit is of using ancient Greek terms. And I think it makes a lot more sense if we just think about it this way: emotion, logic, and authority. That's really the only things that we have to try to convince people of an argument. So, one other thing you want to think about here is which of these strategies is going to be most convincing to your audience based on the argument that you're making. Like we've been saying in this class, your audience, I'm thinking about, your own peers, people who also go to school, people your own age. Um, so you want to think about what would be the most convincing thing to them. One thing that you really want to know here, I think we talked about this with that essay that we looked at. It feels like a million years ago, that essay, writing for an audience, where you want to know if your audience is likely to agree with you or likely to disagree with you. And it's going to depend on the argument that you're making. If you're making an argument that college, should cost less money or something like that, then you know that most of these people are going to be on board. If you're writing for people like yourselves, like writing for college students, they're going to agree, yeah, it's too expensive. So in that case, if you think your audience is likely to agree with you, you can kind of lean more on emotion or tell stories or things like that. More emotional appeals will convince people if they're already kind of on your side. But if you think your audience is likely to disagree with you, I think logic becomes more important, because then they're not going to care about an experience that someone had if they are going to say, well, that's just one person. We need more than that. So if someone's skeptical of what you want to say, you do need more statistics, examples, historical data, things like that. And authority, I think, can kind of works in both cases. But you do want to think about, well, is your audience going to consider the source to be credible? Is it something from a journal? Is it something that was produced by like a political organization? And if so, is that political organization biased? Are they really credible on the topic? So those are some things you would want to think about there. But I would offer these as some of the main ways that we try to convince people, and something that I would really have in mind while you start to work on this essay. What's the best strategy to convince your audience? And which one of these strategies are you using? And I think what we see is that you kind of need to use more than one, right? You need to kind of mix all of these. But which ones are you using more? When are you using certain ones? These are all questions we want to ask ourselves as we start to work on our argumentative essays.